Hello and welcome everyone to Intel on AI. I'm your co-host Ryan Carson.
And I'm your other co-host, Tony Monkolsmy.
So today we are joined by Nathaniel Whittemore. Nathaniel is the founder and CEO of Super Intelligent, which is a platform for learning AI. He's also the host of the AI Daily Brief, which is a podcast and YouTube channel focused on the most important news in AI. And I'm a big fan of his show, and I listen every day. So, Nathaniel, lovely to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to dig into your deep knowledge of AI tools, AI learning, the AI industry. We're just going to go all in on that. And I know our listeners are going to get a lot of good tips from you. So the first question I have is, assuming our listeners are already using an LLM like a ChatGPT or a Claude, what's one valuable task they can accomplish better, faster, or cheaper with AI?
So I think the way to think about this is, and apologize in advance for doing the thing where I take your question and then turn it into a different question. The way that I've seen this work for people is when they move beyond the idea that there's going to be just one sort of revolutionary use case that changes everything about how they work. Instead, what I think we're seeing is lots and lots of small but significant improvements that add up to something really meaningful over time. And so what I mean by that is if you take a task that takes you 20 minutes a day, but it's every day, over the course of a normal work year, if you were able to reduce that 20 minutes, you're winning back something like 2.5 weeks a year, right? You start to multiply that by, a number of different tasks, and all of a sudden you're talking about serious time. Now, that's only the sort of time-saving aspect of AI. There's a whole other dimension, which is sort of that it gives you superpowers, which we can talk about as well. But the way that people get hung up most often and not trying is that they think that there's going to be just sort of one big thing that they have to use it for, that they do, that it'll change everything, when in reality, it's almost that anything that they try that sort of is one of their workflows, they're likely to find ways to improve it. So if you're doing any sort of writing tasks, obviously it's a way to, increase the speed with which you figure out what you're going to write. I think, sometimes people get caught up on uses not feeling sophisticated enough when brainstorming and just sort of ideating, with an LLM as a partner is an incredible source. So, I think for the thing that I would recommend is almost thinking about the daily, or weekly collection of tasks that one has and asking which of them are the most laborious or my least favorite, and starting there and asking, is there a particular workflow that could incorporate AI that could make that slightly less painful? Or are there tools that are specifically kind of purpose built for that particular use?
And those tools that you're talking about, are those specifically, you think, built around kind of like LLMs and prompting, like interacting with something like a ChatGPT? Or do you think that there's different AI tools that might make more sense? Like, do you have something more broad that people might want to consider beyond just LLMs?
Sure. I think there's an emerging sort of landscape of tool categories that are useful to know about and keep in mind. I think generalist models and LLMs are incredibly useful across a broad set of different activities. Obviously, and that's where the lion's share of people who have dabbled at all have dabbled there. There's another category of image generation tools that, again, if you're doing anything with thumbnails or creating social media content, those are going to be incredibly useful. Lagging behind that a little bit in terms of how sophisticated and how sort of deep into production they are things like video tools. Those are sort of still in the infancy stage where, you're only producing a few seconds at a time. There's still a pretty high barrier to entry, which is why you're seeing them still more with amateur filmmakers and things like that. But I don't think that that's going to last for long. I think that you're going to see marketers by sort of this time next year potentially able to use some of those tools. There are avatar generators and sort of digital twins, right? Both audio and video that allow you to create replicas of yourself, which could open up opportunities like doing customized, sales pitch outreach, to people with sort of an avatar version of yourself. And of course, you can start to figure out how to wire all these systems together. So a use case that we recently did a tutorial about had sort of an inbound form on a website trigger a Zapier connection, which created a script in ChatGPT, which then was sent to HeyGen, which created an avatar script, which then populated an email with a video, sort of introducing a potential lead for a software product with a customized video just for them. And so, that's sort of the next layer where you start to figure out how these different things work together. But once again, it's sort of, I think that people get caught up on the idea that they have to know every tool. And it's not that. It's just that there is this big set of tools that if you're willing to take a little time to browse around, you might find something that's really specifically purpose-built for whatever it is that you're trying to do.
Wow. So it feels like we're in this no man's land right now where a lot of execs or leaders want to use LLMs or want to use AI tools, but their data is behind a firewall and they cannot allow an LLM to parse it, to RAG it, et cetera. So how do you think this is going to, number one, how's this going to play out like in the enterprise real world where people want to use tools, but they've got a lot of firewall data? And then number two, follow-up question is, okay, so say that's you. What's one valuable thing that you could do to augment your efficiency if you're behind the corporate firewall?
Sure. So executives are getting paralyzed for two reasons. One good, one not so good. The not so good reason is that they are hung up on this idea of how am I going to prove ROI? And that's leading them to not start and not try things. Meanwhile, we have statistics that show that employees are not waiting for them. LinkedIn and Microsoft just did a study where they found that 75% of knowledge workers are using AI at work, and 78% of them are basically smuggling it in. They're doing it without their boss's knowledge, in large part because of some of these issues. And I think that is a huge indicator of just how valuable these technologies are. In fact, I would argue that we've never seen a workplace technology that has sort of the adoption dynamics of a consumer technology where people are willing to hide it to not have to go back to the way they used to do things before they used it. So bosses and executives in general have to figure out how to get on board. The better reason to be slow is the set of questions that you just asked, right? There are security issues, there are risks. I think a useful framework that I would suggest is starting to think about AI, not monolithically, but in sort of two broad categories. Let's call them horizontal and vertical. Vertical AI are whatever set of solutions are going to be across the entire organization that take advantage of data. So, your customized implementation of ChatGPT or the thing you build with Databricks or Amazon Bedrock that's gone through all the sort of, security approvals, that has a very distinct process where you've made the trade-offs between performance and sort of data security and privacy and risk that makes sense for the organization, and everyone can use that at will, taking advantage of the company's data, right? There's going to be those implementations that cut across the entire organization or big swaths of the organization that are necessarily going to take more time. However, that's not the only way to get value from AI. And I think that there's another category, let's call it horizontal AI, which is much more about the sort of use case that we were just talking about with those employees, where you're empowering them to, within a framework that means that there's less risk, still try these tools, right? So for example, using an LLM off the shelf to write marketing copy is very likely not a risk to your private, data, right? It's not going to, brainstorming ChatGPT, within the marketing department. It doesn't require you to feed a huge amount of data in to get, or proprietary data in to get good uses. But still, because it's sort of broadly lumped into this category of AI, a lot of companies are worried about it. It's much easier than I think people think to be precise about their sort of prescriptions about what people can and can't do. And I think that even as organizations are figuring out those vertical implementations of sort of system-wide implementations, they could be encouraging employees not only to be experimenting with the sort of the long tail of tools for different purposes that they sort of have in a day in, day out kind of way, but also to actually share what's working internally. And I think that this is the biggest thing that people are missing. If you have, like I said, 78% of these employees, 78% of these 75% of employees who are, kind of not telling anyone about what they're doing because they're nervous, that's a huge amount of learning that's staying siloed in that individual person. And again, just to use that silly little time example, if you have 500 people in your organization and one of them has figured out how to save 2 weeks a year, and they could be helping the other 499, but they're not because no one's sort of encouraging them to share that. It's huge, huge loss. So I think that you can win productivity improvements in the short term just by simply kind of, creating a safe space for people to experiment and then talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, empowering your employees to use the tooling, which actually leads to my next question. So if you're a manager, you're a people leader, let's go a little deeper on that. What is one valuable workflow or task or even project that you can empower your team and your employees to tackle? And how do you train them? Like, how do you roll out AI skills and empower your team with AI if you're a manager?
So two pretty big different questions here. One is sort of what are the categories of tasks, and then the second is maybe how to train them or how to help with that. On the first part, I think maybe a framework to use is it's a pretty safe assumption that almost any function in the organization is going to have some way that they could take advantage of AI. And so I think that a helpful starting point is to almost lay those out on a risk continuum and figure out where your lines of your organization are. Which types of uses are you comfortable with right now? Which aren't you? And what sort of triggers one to move into the other? Because again, this is a spectrum type of a thing where it's not like you have to do everything to win some of these benefits. So if you're an organization that was literally only comfortable with the example that we were just using of you can brainstorm social media copy with LLMs, you would still, I think, get significant benefit from these tools. And almost certainly enough to justify $30 a month or whatever it is for your premium ChatGPT subscription times however many people in the organization are using it. So I think that it's there are lots and lots of ways to dip toes in the water without going too deep, where people will still get familiar. They'll start to have ideas about how this can work. It'll certainly under maximize what could happen, but everyone doesn't have to race all the way into the deep end to figure this out. Social media and marketing is an example that I find lots and lots of organizations are comfortable with that type of use. I think where it starts to get a little more nerve-wracking for people is when it comes to using, proprietary data for analysis and things like that. But again, there's lots and lots of categories that don't fall into that. So I would mostly encourage people to just find a starting point that is comfortable and try to get as much information as possible from sort of the people who are actually using it to see if and where it might be applicable in other parts of the organization. In terms of how to learn, there's no real wrong answer. I think that in general, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the way to learn AI is by using AI. And I think having a bias towards solutions and approaches that are getting people into actually using the tools is really important. This is why we created Super Intelligent. It's why we anchored it around short, fast tutorials paired with sort of step-by-step how-tos. We didn't want to create sort of a round of courseware that takes 10 hours before you're getting into the meat of something. We wanted people to be trying it within minutes. I think also, what we're seeing is that it's likely going to be a stack of solutions that helps people learn how to do this stuff. An example of this being, there's a whole category of change consultants, strategic advisors, people who come in, do the big 2-day seminar that get people thinking about things differently. It's really valuable. A lot of those folks are very good at helping people like jog out of their sort of traditional way of thinking and looking at that. However, if you think about those things as your only solution, you might miss sort of, some of the more practical applied stuff. Likewise, if you were even, as much as I'd like to have people just dive in and buy, 1,000 seats on Super Intelligent for their whole team, if you're not also having those big structural conversations, at a management level around how this is going to work, how employees are going to be encouraged, how new policies can be used to support this, you're going to undermine the technology as well. And so I think just thinking holistically about this, treating it as a new paradigm for computing, a new paradigm for interaction within the organization and between the organization and customers and other stakeholders will lead people to have appropriately holistic approaches to this sort of reimagining of the organization.
And you mentioned ChatGPT. You earlier mentioned Databricks, et cetera. So, ChatGPT kind of took off, I feel like, and you mentioned their premium subscription because it's kind of a self-serve model, right? You can try it, you can use it, and it's very intuitive with how you use it in terms of the interaction that you can get out of it, like for your marketing folks, the brainstorming, et cetera. Do you think that businesses are going to have to try to integrate AI workflows themselves as a company? If I'm a business leader, am I saying, how am I getting a technical person in here to help build my AI workflow? Or do you think we're going to get a lot of the outsourcing where I would say, I'm going to a company like Databricks or somebody else who's going to build kind of this vertical service solution, and that's how I should interact with AI? Do you have any perspective on where you think that's going?
I think that it's going to be a lot of both. And I think maybe there's a third category that sort of sits somewhere between these two. If you have sort of fully bespoke on the one hand and fully off the shelf on the other. In the middle, you have this new generation of purpose-built tools that are basically doing that bespoke work, but highly focusing it on a particular type of workflow that happens over and over. So just by way of example, to look at the variety of writing type tools that sit on top of LLMs. You could use ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your preferred LLM is, obviously for social media copy, for SEO. Like those are well-trodden uses. But there are a number of different tools that are trying to create interfaces that surround those technologies that integrate other types of tooling and software that are specific to that particular use case, SEO, et cetera, and sort of bring it together in a package that is really hyper designed for that use. There's a question of how much tools like that can survive in the long run. Are they too far away from the state of the art? Will people just default to sort of the ChatGPTs? And my guess is that there will always be room for sort of the people will always want access to the state of the art when it comes to sort of LLMs and their most complicated uses. But I think that a lot of those sort of custom purpose-built tools will do very well as sort of, in between type of solutions for people who have that use case over and over again. When it comes to the more complex integrations, I think that my guess is that it's going to take some time to resolve which types of organizational uses are a right fit for that. One of the things that I've heard a lot of chatter about from people who speak with clients a lot and sort of enterprises a lot is I've seen them express surprise at how many organizations are actually comfortable more or less just using the sort of customized ChatGPT models off the shelf rather than doing something totally bespoke and customized. I think there's a lot to be said for that convenience for a lot of organizations. And when push comes to shove, they're deciding to trust OpenAI and their partners in Microsoft and are willing to do that. And so where I think that those sort of much more bespoke answers will come in is in the context of unique workflows that are more complex, that require sort of a different level of thinking to actually sort of achieve the outcomes. Now, the thing that could throw this all into disarray is sort of the rise of agents that are, not just sort of being manipulated by humans, but are actually, accomplishing tasks on their own. I think, that'll require a whole different type of thinking that we have, haven't even really scratched the surface on yet.
Yeah. It feels like a lot of companies are not going to have to protect absolute trade secrets like we have at Intel here, right? We have absolutely clear rules around, putting design diagrams into an LLM, and we have our own custom GPTs for this internally. But a lot of companies aren't like that, right? You have some data. Yes, you'd rather not be in the public, but if it doesn't matter. And I'm and now we pretty much have drag and drop, click and play RAG, or you have these huge context windows that you could dump, 2 million tokens into. And so it feels like a lot of companies end up going to just use off the shelf products like that. And then you get kind of bucketed into, okay, if everybody in your organization is on a PC, you're probably going to end up on an AI PC. Maybe you'll be using Copilot plus PC, so you'll end up using Copilot. And I wonder how much of these smaller tools are going to survive or matter. Do you think we'll see kind of the juggernauts end up owning most of the tooling and the end user just goes, I just hit the Copilot button on my PC and stuff happens? Or are we going to see a million flowers grow from AI developers offering hyper verticalized solutions?
I think that it's more likely that the dominant use cases get absorbed by sort of the handful of big winners. I think that, there's a bit of this pattern already, when it comes to software, that eventually sort of, the startups become the incumbents and they reach juggernaut size. What's different about AI is that, there's a bunch of things that have sort of shifted the speed with which this dynamic has taken hold. The first is obviously just the incredible cost to compete in this space, right? Silicon Valley venture capital literally doesn't have the amount of capital to sort of compete. You couldn't fund the sort of LLM competition just on Sand Hill Road, which is we've never seen that before. We've never seen anything like it. That's why Microsoft was able to sort of get this toehold in. That's why Anthropic's raised from Google and Amazon, and so there's that whole cost dimension. But then on top of that, I think maybe something that was even less expected was the extent to which, because this is a technology that is better when it does have access to sources of data, companies have defaulted to the players that they already trust, right? And so if you are dealing with, if your options are the absolute state of the art or within 10% of the state of the art, but from a partner that you've had a data relationship with for a decade, it's not really a choice for most companies. It's very, very easy. And so I think that the sort of the incumbent players, the existing, SaaS software players, the existing big tech companies have an advantage that we wouldn't necessarily have seen before. We're seeing this a little bit also in terms of just, one of the big questions is how much these sort of more individualized models can compete against the big general models. That's a technical question that we don't really have answers to yet. I think for a little while, it seemed that sort of maybe more customized models would have a place to go. But then Sora came out, and people started to ask maybe just the big general models are going to eat everything, and so there's all these sort of really interesting technical questions. Where I do think that individual companies can flourish and will flourish is in these sort of like highly purpose-built solutions where they really understand a particular use case, and for whatever reason they just care more about doing it well than others. Their destiny may still be to get, it may be a question of which of the big tech companies is going to buy us rather than sort of, carving something out entirely on their own. But again, I also think that that's a little bit based on this first generation of generative AI that's sort of not agentic, and that is, it's a totally open ball game once we get to that next phase. And it is likely that some new companies will reimagine our sort of interactions in ways that we can't really anticipate yet, and might become sort of, the juggernauts of the next era.
All right, let's close it out with a final question, which is essentially, how do execs and leaders just not feel overwhelmed all the time by the just exhausting pace of AI innovation? So, you're overwhelmed constantly with, there's a new model out on Hugging Face. There is a new tool over here. There's a new way to learn over here. How can folks tackle this day to day and just not want to go back to bed?
Well, I think that the one important thing is to remember that it is being built for them. It is an unbelievably valuable set of tools that, if they take the time to figure out, will be helpful. There's just simply no doubt. Like, no one can sit with these technologies and not find ways to make them useful. And I think from that, because my next sort of piece of advice, which is, there's no one tool that you have to know, nor are there, do you need to know every tool? In fact, I would argue that right now, you can't really throw a stick at the AI industry without hitting something useful. So it's almost like you could blindfold pick a tool from the full list of everything. And I'm talking from like the big guys to the random thing that just launched on Product Hunt, and you are likely to be able to get some value out of it. Start by starting is the absolute best advice that I can have. Pick one tiny thing that you feel like is non-controversial, that is unlikely to implicate big kind of privacy questions or data security questions. Try it, start there, let your teams figure it out and explore, have them share up what they learned, and then go for the next one. I think what will be rewarded over the next few years are people who start by starting and just start trying. I think what will be, sort of punished is people who get paralyzed by indecision, by overwhelming choice, and don't do something. I think that a lot of people are locked in this. They're trying to apply sort of these old proof of concept models where they do a little experiment and then move on. your employees are already doing it. You might as well listen to them and see what you can get from it.
Absolutely. I guess like the saying goes is AI is not going to take your job, but somebody that learns how to use AI is. So as it comes.
And I have a feeling that might be the most true for managers and executives.
Yeah, most likely.
Do you think that the employees going ahead in this cycle, I think that's not necessarily different than it has been in the past. I would say that at least in tech companies, right, we have lots of things where people kind of do a project on the side and then bring it into the company and say, hey, this is how I did it. This is how I made this happen. What do you guys think? And you end up with a good product there. Do you think that companies are starting to be more open about that, where they want to go to their employees and say, all right, how are you guys using this? And then bringing that in-house. Is that something that you've seen right now? Because I would imagine that your users would be the perfect people for that, where somebody said, hey, our whole team needs to learn because Joe brought in this example of something that worked, and I want all of our guys to learn this. Are you seeing that pick up?
100%. It's absolutely happening. And where it's happening is with the sort of organizations that were often first to experiment with their own custom, ChatGPT or LLM. I think what a lot of people find is those custom solutions are great, but then people are still using all these other things. And because they've already built a culture where, it's clearly a priority for that organization, they're actually hearing about all the things that their employees are doing. And then they start trying to actually sort of, harness that more. So we have a lot of conversations with, for example, a Big Four accounting firm who are all in on this idea of empowering their employees and going bottoms up. And it's because they've now, 6 or 9 months into their experiment with custom sort of versions of GPT. And it's not that they're not working. It's just that they're sort of unlocking an entire set of behaviors for employees, and they want all of it. So I think organizations are going to get to this fast. I think that the sort of the fear of, well, what if, when it comes to our data and privacy and things like that is very quickly being overwhelmed by but what is the upside opportunity if we figure this out? So I think it's going to be a shift that's going to happen quite quickly and is only going to accelerate as sort of stories of the way that people are getting benefit from these tools and these platforms are coming into the market.
Yeah.
Love it. So one of the things that you do is run Super Intelligent. You actually teach people these things. What is the most popular lesson at the moment? What do you think? What does everybody just gravitate to right away?
So it's funny. There are 2 categories. One is things that sort of expands people's imagination, and the other are just really boring, prosaic, day in, day out stuff, right? So we will often see, people love this new generation of no-code tools, text to UI tools. And I think this makes sense because a lot of the value of, or a lot of the wonder of using AI comes from sort of that first blush of seeing your capacity to create expand in front of your eyes. And, that's the experience that a lot of us had the first time we used like a Midjourney, where it's like, we weren't artists before, but we can create worlds from our imagination now. And it's a very empowering feeling. Text to UI, text to web application. And there's a variety of these tools who are coming online. Sort of takes that in a new range. And there's lots of people out there who have, had an idea for an app, but, never have learned to code. And the barrier to learn to code has been too high. And I think that's crumbling. So people really love those and are attracted to them on the sort of just, I don't have a particular use for it yet, but I like the idea that I can do that. But then on the flip side, it's like how to use the new Copilot and PowerPoint tools. It's, the Copilot integrated into Word. It's these things that are just the places that people already live, the tools that they're already using, the integrations that they're already finding. That's the stuff that day in and day out is going to drive a lot of this behavior. And so it's kind of an interesting barbell where, it's either extremely like hyper practical because they're already in there, or extremely far out imagining, sort of the futures that might be.
Absolutely. I hadn't coded production code for years, and then I retaught myself how to code in TypeScript. And I remember it sort of conjuring a Next.js app, with the power of AI and that feeling of like, wow, creation, just like a Midjourney creation, creating with code. And now we have v0.dev, and you can just, summon a UI from nothing. You're right. It's wildly creative and empowering. So Nathaniel, really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. What's the best place for people to find you and learn more about what you do?
On Twitter, I am at NLW. or I guess X now. You can learn about superintelligent at bsuper.ai. And honestly, basically on any network, I'm going to be NLW. So you can find me, wherever you live.
Oh, you've been on the internet long enough to be NLW.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, thanks again for being on the show, and we will catch you online. Take care.
Appreciate it.